Now back to that complex grammar. Children need exposure to complex grammar in order to support their learning and development. They need to be exposed to it because their brain learns it implicitly. The most common place that they pick up complex grammar is when we read to them, but we do need to read certain books that have complex grammar in. So let's take a conditional. That's a form of complex grammar. If I say, if she was a scientist, she would work in a lab. Now, a child can replicate that sentence, no problem. But what they will think that it means is that she is a scientist. Now, remember, I said if she was a scientist. If you ask them what that sentence means, they assume she is a scientist. So they've not quite comprehended it. Comprehension does improve with age. So by the time your child is 5, they're going to have a really decent comprehension of most grammar, but not necessarily the complex stuff. Some adults never reach full comprehension, and that's because they haven't had sufficient exposure to complex grammar. There was a study at the University of Oxford that showed that there's a link between being able to understand conditional sentences and the ability to understand scientific hypotheses. So these comprehension skills are really important for cognitive development generally. If they don't acquire complex grammar, they're going to struggle with things like conditionals, like hypotheticals and counterfactuals. So a hypothetical is something like, if I exercise more, I will get fitter. That's a hypothetical. Scientific hypotheses are hypothetical. Counterfactuals are things that are posing something but in the past. So if I had taken the bus, would I have been on time is a counterfactual. The more exposure kids get to complex grammar, the more likely they are to implicitly acquire it. And that's because our brain needs repeated exposure to be able to form those connections, to consolidate that learning and that pattern that they're implicitly picking up. Now, Julia Badger is a departmental lecturer of child and developmental education at the University of Oxford, and she actually created a book called The Nighttime Cat and The Box Cat, both books that my kids loved, that allow parents to expose children to complex grammar at a very early age. There are things that you can do today to help expose your children to complex grammar. You don't need to teach them. They just need to be exposed to it. So you just have to read them stories and literature that contains these forms of grammar. Children aged 5 to 8, you can read things by authors like C.S. Lewis or Roald Dahl. For older children, so over 8, you can read things like the Percy Jackson series, Philip Pullman, these long book series, things like Percy Jackson, that have increasingly complex language and that actually require you to have memory around the characters and the plots as they're evolving. So sentences do become quite complex because you're having to remember conditionals about characters in certain plot lines.